Today, we're diving into the really chilling true story of Fritz Honka. He was a serial killer whose awful crimes in Hamburg's red light district went completely unnoticed. That is, until they were discovered by sheer dumb luck.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's July 15th, 1975 in Hamburg. Take a look at this apartment building. Looks totally normal, right? Just another building in a regular neighborhood. But inside, a truly horrific secret was festering, and it was about to be exposed by pure chance. So you have to ask yourself, what could possibly be going on behind those walls? Well, when firefighters were called to this building for a fire, what they ended up finding had nothing to do with smoke or flames. It was a discovery that would absolutely shock the entire country.
And here's the thing. The truth didn't come out because of some brilliant detective work or a long-term investigation. Nope. It was all because of a fire. An emergency call about something totally unrelated would end up unraveling this whole horrific story. So imagine you're a firefighter rushing into apartment 74 to put out a blaze. While you're in there, you stumble on something awful. A partially decomposed female torso stuffed into a plastic bag. Right away, you know it's a crime scene, but nobody could have guessed just how bad it was. And the man who lived there, his name was Fritz Honka.
So who was this guy living in that apartment? To really get a handle on the crimes, you kind of have to understand the life that led him there.
Fritz Honka's life, honestly, was just marked by hardship from the very beginning. He was born into a huge, struggling family, one of 10 kids. He always described his childhood as traumatic, which isn't surprising. All of this led to a lifelong brutal battle with alcoholism, and on top of that, a really nasty car accident left him with a prominent squint, a physical trait he was known for.
This quote from his trial, wow. It gives you a pretty stark glimpse into how he saw his own upbringing. Now, whether he was literally in a concentration camp for children is up for debate, but the statement itself reveals this deep, deep sense of trauma and victimhood that he carried with him from his earliest days in post-war Germany. And when you look at the timeline of his life, you can just see this clear downward spiral. First, his father dies from complications after being imprisoned by the Nazis. Then he spends his youth bouncing between children's homes, can't hold down a job. Then comes the car accident that messes up his face. And by the 1960s, 2 failed marriages just pushed him further and further into isolation. And of course, drinking. So, between 1970 and 1975, Honka's life of quiet, lonely desperation took a monstrous turn. He started prowling the pubs and back alleys of Hamburg's St. Pauli district, and he was looking for victims. These were his 4 known victims: Gertraud Brauer, who was 42, Anna Beuschel, 54, Frieda Roblick, 57, and Ruth Schult, who was 52. You know, these aren't just names on a slide. These were real women with real lives that were just brutally cut short. 4 women, and they were all vulnerable, often struggling themselves with things like alcoholism or homelessness. Honka would meet them at a pub called the Golden Glove and other bars in the area, and he'd lure them back to his attic apartment. Now, his method for hiding what he did was, well, it was horrifyingly basic. He just hid the dismembered remains of 3 of his victims right there in his own apartment. And get this, neighbors were constantly complaining about the awful smell, but their concerns were just dismissed, written off as just one of those things you deal with in a crowded building. Meanwhile, Honka was trying to cover up the stench with tons of those pine-scented air freshener blocks. And that brings us right back to where we started, that fire on July 15th, 1975. That completely random accident is what finally set off the investigation that would bring Fritz Honka to justice. So Hanna was working as a night watchman, and he had absolutely no idea his apartment was on fire. The police found him at his job and arrested him. At first, he confessed to everything, giving them all the grim details. But then, by the time of his trial, he'd completely changed his story, claiming he couldn't remember a single thing. The court's final verdict was pretty complicated. He was found guilty of 1 count of murder for his first victim, Gertraud Brauer. But for the other 3 women, the charge was knocked down to manslaughter. So, why the difference? It really all came down to one thing: his severe, long-term alcoholism. The court basically ruled that his mental state was so damaged by his addiction during those later murders that he couldn't be held fully responsible in the same way he was for the first one. So the final sentence for 1 murder and 3 counts of manslaughter was 15 years. And he wasn't sent to a normal prison. He was to serve his time in a psychiatric hospital.
But, believe it or not, the story doesn't end there with his conviction. What happened after he served his sentence is, in some ways, maybe the most unsettling part of this whole thing.
After he was released in 1993, Fritz Honka just vanished. He took on a new, totally anonymous name, Peter Jensen, and he lived out the rest of his life in complete obscurity. A ghost. He eventually died in a hospital in 1998. He was 63 years old. In the end, the infamous monster of St. Pauli just faded away, not as a notorious killer, but as some anonymous old guy named Peter Jensen. The case of Fritz Honka is just such a disturbing reminder of how easily the most vulnerable people in society can be overlooked and forgotten, and how the absolute worst horrors can be hidden right behind an ordinary door, just waiting for a single accident to drag them into the light.